none of this actually matters.
Say more.
And I got a tattoo on my arm last year that it says walking each other home in Hindi. And it's the Ram Dass quote reminding each other that none of this matters. We're just taking care of each other until we die. We are just walking each other home. That, at the end of the day, when we get so focused around our business and business being our hobby, like business isn't a hobby, it's a business.
Yeah.
Hobbies are hobbies. I just saw that the founder of OnlyFans, who is worth billions of dollars, just died yesterday at 47 years old. Well, he's not taking those billions with him. And
Yeah.
I really hope he enjoyed the journey of building the business.
They said getting started was the hardest part, but no one told you how hard it is to scale a custom service business. It's time for your team to step up, but your clients want you. Discover how to scale to 7 figures and beyond by freeing up time and getting your team to run whole parts of the company so you can focus on scaling profits. This is the Hands Off CEO with Mandi Ellefson.
All right. Welcome to the Hands Off CEO podcast. Today on the show, we have Cameron Herold. And Cameron, we've kind of been orbiting each other's circles for a number of years now. And I have really respected Cameron's work a lot. And it's nice to finally have him on the podcast. Thanks for coming on, Cameron.
And of course, you're welcome. Good to see you, Mandy.
Yeah, likewise. Well, Cameron, he is a founder of COO Alliance and the former COO who helped scale 1-800 Got Junk. And you guys took that from what, 2 million to 106 million in revenue
Yeah,
in
in
just
six
6 years?
years. Crazy.
Totally crazy. So I have questions. I have questions on that. So he has launched a new book. Well, why don't you tell us, what is your new book called?
Sure. So the newest book is called Grandmother's Business Tips, and it's all around the different grandmother sayings that I had growing up, and kind of took to heart, and just as kind of the timeless, I guess, lessons that still kind of existed. And I thought about them as they applied to the business world. The one that kind of jumped at me right away was don't put all your eggs in one basket. And I remember talking to a bunch of clients about this over and over again and realizing that that was somebody my grandmother had always mentioned, but I never really understood how it applied to anything other than she would just say it, or momentum creates momentum, or all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, or just having small town values, or the emperor's no clothes suit. And it was all of these sayings that we kind of grew up with that I realized really were applicable in more than just life. They were actually applicable to business. And then I've always felt like business is quite simple, but we overcomplicate it. I see business owners that, are trying to use all the newest tools or trying to use all the newest systems, or think that, that you need to have MBAs involved in analyzing stuff. And business is quite simple. I mean, deliver what you promise, respect the individual, charge properly so you have enough, gross margin to pay for your overhead, hire really great people, treat them well. Business can be quite simple. So we just decided to take all these grandmotherisms
Mhm.
and think about how they applied to business, and out of it popped a book.
Nice. Yeah. Well, and I know that this is not your first book. You have a number of other books.
Yeah.
Um, I know you're the host of the Second in Command podcast, which is a very good podcast. How long have you guys been running that?
I started running it around 9 years ago now. I think we've interviewed 550 COOs, typically mid-sized to enterprise level companies, but I've had the COO of Shopify, Bumble, Asana, Kajabi, Active Campaign. I just had the founder or the former president of Tesla and the former COO of Lyft on the podcast. So we've interviewed some really, really great second in commands. I had during the American election, I really wanted to get somebody who was the second in command to a presidential candidate. So I
Mm.
reached out to the Trump campaign. I reached out to um, oh shit, why am I blanking? Who the hell was he running against?
It wasn't Biden,
Biden,
Kamala.
yeah, the Biden campaign. And then I also
Okay.
reached out to the RFK campaign, and I ended up getting the
Okay.
second in command to RFK, which was extraordinary to hear how somebody comes on and starts a political campaign, has to hire all the people and deal with internal and external comms and budgeting and marketing and sales and productivity and planning. And then literally 18 months later, they're out of a job. and it was kind of extraordinary to listen to somebody who is so, so talented, and how they actually ran a political campaign where they were really never in the limelight. They were doing it for somebody else. So yeah, that was I've always wanted the rest of the story, I think. I've always heard the entrepreneur's story, and I really wanted to know the rest of the story, which is really that operational lens. I remember talking to Guy Raz, who runs the podcast How I Built This. We
Mhm.
were talking at the TED conference about 8 or 9 years ago, and he'd just interviewed Brian from 1-800 Got Junk. And I loved the episode, but I was the COO during that period, and there was a whole different perspective. And then I started to recognize a bunch of other guests that he had on the show, and I had known the COOs of those businesses, and it just kind of made sense to go out and tell their stories now too.
Right. And there is a very different story. And as you were saying that, I'm actually thinking about how that is different with how our operators, our second in commands, because we have an incubator for our operations managers, for our COOs. There's lots of different titles that they can go under, right? For the different sizes of companies in different industries. But they have a very different perspective than the CEOs, and they should, because part of their job, if they're doing it well, is that the CEO doesn't have to know all those things.
Well, and I think the job of the second in command is to make the CEO iconic. It's to remove all the hard decisions from their plate, to remove all the tough decisions, to remove all of the saying of no, and allowing them to be the figurehead and the kind of role model for the entrepreneur to rally around, like the Howard Schultz or the Ray Kroc or the Walt Disney. How do we make that person iconic? Well, it's by taking all the tough stuff off their plate. And then it's also very similar to a mom and dad in a traditional family, as a partnership and raising a family. You could ask the mom, how did you raise your kids? And she would have a very true story. You could ask the dad, how did you raise the kids? He would have a very true story. And it's not like either of them is making it up. They just have a different lens on what their role was on providing that kind of family upbringing. And it's very similar to that COO role. And then Harvard wrote an article years ago called The Misunderstood Role of the COO. It was in Harvard Business Review. And
Mm.
it talked about 7 distinct types of chief operating officers and how they show up and work with their CEO. So we just started to notice some differences versus, the chief marketing officer, chief technology officer. Those roles tend to be fairly similar in all companies of that industry. The COO tends to be more of the yin and yang to the CEO. It's a real, it's like like someone's wife could be great as a match for that husband, but it might be a terrible match for me, right? Because that partnership has to match their goals and their age and their hobbies and their core values and where they grow up and what they want to do with their lives. That's very different, as is the COO CEO relationship.
Yeah. So that was in Harvard Business Review. And what was the title on that again?
It's called The Misunderstood Role of the COO.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear.
And then I even looked at a lot of different COOs and recognized that they're not lower level CEOs. They're not even most of them don't even ever want to be a CEO. It's like
Mm.
most men are not hairy versions of women. We're different. We see the
Right.
world differently. We perceive the world. Most men don't want to be women. A couple do and they transition over, but most guys are happy being guys. Most women are happy being women. The same with most COOs. Sheryl Sandberg was the COO for Facebook. She was the adult in the room. She came into Facebook when Mark was only, I think, 21 or 22. She was there for 15 years being his second in command, probably very capable to be an entrepreneur, no desire to do that. She was always quite happy. And for the most part, she was really in his shadows for probably 13 of the 15 years. I don't think
Mm.
anyone really even knew who she was or who that, she played a very inward facing role in that organization for the longest time.
So what do you think is the biggest distinction that makes, a second in command want to be a second in command versus its CEO?
I think they want to make someone's dreams happen. They maybe want to work in an entrepreneurial organization, but they don't want the risk, or they don't have the vision, or they recognize that they just like to actually help someone get stuff done. They like to help people. My core purpose, it's interesting. You know the name Simon Sinek? He
Yeah.
wrote the book Start with Why. Simon was on our board of advisors back in the 1-800 Got Junk days. He was on our board 5 years before he wrote the book Start with Why. And he was at my home one night for dinner. We were making pasta, and we were talking about why I do what I do, why I built the three companies prior to 1-800 Got Junk, why I liked coaching franchisees. And I said, I like I like helping entrepreneurs. I feel like they're all like a fly banging their head on the window and they're going to try harder, but they end up dead on the windowsill.
Yeah.
And I said, I want to show them the shortcuts. I want to show them the path of least resistance. I want to help them make their vivid vision come true. And so he said, your core purpose is to help entrepreneurs make their vision come true. That's why
Hmm.
I've always done what I've done. So for me, I've never necessarily wanted to be that entrepreneur. Now, I also recognize that I'm a very different DNA type from many COOs. I am meant to be in that entrepreneurial zone as the partner or the mentor to a CEO, whereas some get in more as a change agent or an executor or in a turnaround kind of a role. That's not me. I've always done it in more of that entrepreneurial side where in some ways even been part of the face of the brand.
So then so then are you saying that you actually would prefer to be more of the second in command as opposed to the CEO? Is that
If
where
I
you
was
feel?
running a big company, I would rather be the COO. And
Okay.
I've been running my own company for 19 years. I was an entrepreneur when I was 20. I had 12 full-time employees when I was 20 years old in my first
Hmm.
business. So I've always been an entrepreneur, but always small-sized companies. But then I've always coached and mentored mid-sized to enterprise level. I
That
coached
makes
the
sense.
CEO of Sprint. I was coaching the COO of Sprint for 18 months, like the 82nd largest company in the US. I coached a number of technology companies that had exits, $100 million exits. In that zone of me helping the entrepreneur, I'd rather be the COO. If it's a small entrepreneurial, then I'd probably rather be the entrepreneur and just do it because I can execute a little bit faster than executing through someone else.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you've had a chance to interview all of these different COOs and second in commands on your podcast of very large companies. So what
hmm
are some of the differences and distinctions that you're seeing with companies that are operating at that level versus a smaller one?
Well, once you get, there's a few, I call it the ones and threes, that a company changes when you go one employee to three, right? You hired a couple people, you can delegate. When you go from 3 to 10, you probably have your first manager who's managing some people for you. When you get to 30, you probably have your first management team, but they're all new. They've never done it before. They've all been promoted to their level of incompetence or their ceiling of complexity. When you go from 30 to 100, you have your first leadership team of people that have probably built companies before. When you get to 300, you have a very seasoned leadership team. They've done it. You've got, an HR department in place, but politics are starting to creep in. And then you go to the 1,000 and 3,000, and you're managing, cross-functional decision making and strategic. You're deploying. Just a lot more complexity starts to creep in at that point. And I think at that point, a lot of bloat tends to happen, right? Where people are building out their silos, they're building out their little turfs, they're trying to, you know, to kind of gain ground inside of an organization. That just is something you have to break through. When I was coaching the CEO of Sprint, Marcelo, I was trying to work with him on, he had already sold his first company for over $1 billion to SoftBank, and then he was appointed the CEO of Sprint. I was coaching him around helping Sprint become more entrepreneurial and helping his second in command, Jamie Jones, become a more entrepreneurial leader inside of a big corporate company that he'd worked at for 27 years. So I was trying to take this corporate politics, strategic, everything was a slide deck and pivot tables to be able to become more of an entrepreneurial turnaround company. So that was what I was coaching them on. It's just different.
That's really interesting. Let's double click on that. So then how does a company go from being on the more corporate side to then being more entrepreneurial? What is the process you took them through on that?
It kind of starts with vision. It starts with sitting down and deciding what they want to be. One of the things Marcelo identified was they had a lot of waste inside of the company, right? He tried to cut $4 billion in operating expenses. Like, I don't even know where you start with that, but he started by slashing expense accounts, slashing private jets, sending signals that we're no longer acting like this big old corporate,
Mhm.
company. He started making decisions faster. I tried to get him to humanize the decisions, and because he's this 6'8" driving at 100 miles an hour leader, I wanted him to soften his approach a little bit, drop some emojis into some of his messages, do videos that he sends out to the team instead of audio or text messages, because his video would soften him. You see this big, huge guy smiling, and he comes across much, much more engaging than this, empowering, imposing figure. But for them, it was just becoming more entrepreneurial. It was getting rid of the corporate, getting rid of the waste. I was just looking at it from, I've never worked in the cell phone industry, but from the outside, I'm like, why could I just buy a Tesla and spend $130,000 on a Tesla Model S in 2016 and purchase the car off a website, never having test drove it, but you need stores for people to go buy a cell phone? This doesn't make any sense. And you're
Mm.
complaining about customers coming in the door that are your low ticket customers, your customers that don't upsell or don't buy anything, but it's because all of your advertising is on television. The only people watching TVs are people that can't afford, DVRs or can't afford streaming services. So of course you're putting your money into the wrong market. So we just tried to like get them to see stuff that they weren't necessarily seeing.
Okay. And that is really interesting too, because what you're actually it's just modernizing, and they're the same. These are the same problems that smaller companies are having too,
Yeah,
where
well, I think it's funny. I was sitting in Marcelo's office in Kansas City one day, just he and I in his boardroom, and we were top grading his team. We were looking through all of the people on his team and deciding who had to get fired, who had to change seats, who maybe needed some coaching or development, and then who he needed to handcuff in the organization. And he had one person who he was complaining about. He said everyone on the leadership team complains about them. This guy was very political, very corporate, was never going to be an entrepreneurial leader. And he had a C-level title. And I said, you have to fire him. And Marcel was like, oh, I can't fire him. He's been here for 20 odd years. He's got the C-level title. And I said, well, last time I checked, you had the CEO title. And he put a red X through the person's name. There's somebody who is even at the highest level still has the blocks of I can't do things, right? But then when
no.
I'm able to come in from the outside and say, why not? And show him a lens and hold up a mirror, all of a sudden the changes happen. But then he started laughing and he said, when do people no longer be the problem? And I was like, well, if you're the 82nd largest company in the US still talking about people issues, they're always the problem, right? It
Right,
never gets easier. But and then on the smaller company size, companies tend to struggle because they've never trained their people. I think
right.
about almost everyone listening right now or watching our interview does job interviews. They interview and hire people, and at best, most of them have only ever read a book on hiring. So they have no training. They've never been
Yeah,
coached. They've never been developed on doing interviews. Everybody runs meetings, and almost no one has ever had any training on how to run highly successful meetings. I remember when Elon sent out a text message about 6 years ago, and he said, if you're in a shitty meeting, stand up and leave the meeting. And I sent him a
I
message.
love
His brother worked for me 20 or 33 years ago. Kimball Musk worked for me at College Pro Painters back in the early 90s. So I sent Elon a message. I said, don't tell your people to leave shitty meetings. Fix the meetings so that they're not in shitty meetings. Like you talk about first principles, leaving a shitty meeting means you just haven't fixed the core problem. So I think most of the small to medium-sized companies have had no training on managing and leading and coaching and delegating and time management and project management and interviewing and running meetings. So they walk around saying that business is hard. Business is actually quite easy if you've been trained on the basic skills. Kind of like
that.
a kid going off to play Little League baseball. If you don't teach them how to hold the glove and catch a ball and toss the ball and how to hit with the bat, just even the basics, they come home from baseball saying baseball sucks. And it's like, no, Johnny, you suck at baseball.
Yeah.
So I think that's what happens in the small companies. So for me, I've always just had that lens as to the growth of people or growth of businesses, and try to give them the skills to be able to help them with that.
Yeah, I personally have seen that when we have developed our people internally, like the amount of output I can get from one person is 10 times what they could have done when they first came in. And that's from good, proper training programs. And sometimes it's just a matter of you giving time and also you allowing them to fail, giving them parameters where they can succeed and where they can fail and helping
Totally.
them learn from it.
One of the things I talked about in the classroom teaching model of my Invest in Your Leaders training is that the learner controls the learning environment. And until the learner has stubbed their toe or fallen off the bicycle or failed at something, they're normally not ready to learn, right? They need to have struggled with something and then they go, okay, Yoda, teach me. So the other thing I've seen, and this is especially happens in the sales world, is a sales manager will go out with a salesperson to do a sales call, or they'll listen in on a sales call, And as soon as the salesperson is struggling or failing, the manager swoops in to save the day, changes everything, lands the client and go there. That's how it's done. But what they miss is the other six failures the person was going to have throughout the rest of the call that they haven't had a chance to see, and they've missed all those coaching moments. So,
Right.
but again, most leaders have never been trained on situational leadership or on coaching or on classroom teaching. And so at the end of the day, they have these people trying their best, but they don't know how to develop them. It's one of the reasons why a dad or a mom, it's so hard to teach your kid a sport is because they're too close to us. Whereas you get a third party that can come in and coach them and they'll listen or they'll learn.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I found was that when my manager first came on a few years back, one of his blind spots is he just was a little too soft on people. And I saw this, and there was someone in the company who needed to be fired. And
Mhm.
I was ready to fire her right away, but he was not ready to fire her, and he had put his flag in the sand and wanted to really nurture this person up to support them to actually be effective. And I already knew she was never going to be effective. And so, I calculated what was this going to cost of him finding out this on his own. I'm like, this is worth the amount of salary that's going to take. So go for it. Go figure it out. And I just allowed him to fail. And I allowed him to actually see that what I was saying was actually the case. And that was such an incredible lesson for him that has really helped the company and has helped him in his own development.
Well, a lot of, yeah, you did it in the right way. A lot of leaders have never had any training on how to fire someone properly, with integrity, with still caring about that person, but they don't get to come back to work here anymore. A lot of leaders try to save face and they want to look like the good person in the company, so they don't want to. And then the other one is they're trying to be so nice to that person by not firing them,
Right.
but they're being mean to all the A players and B players,
Who are
right?
all picking up the slack.
By keeping a C player, an underperformer, or a toxic individual for so long, you're actually being mean to the A's and B's inside of the company. So you're being nice to the wrong people. So I think we need to help people recognize that at some point it is time to exit some of those people. Now, I also believe that it's also time to examine, if you're blaming the person saying, well, that's the wrong person, we have to get rid of them, you're pointing the finger saying we have to get rid of that person. There's three fingers pointing back at you, right?
Right.
Why did we hire that person in the first place? How did we get to the stage that we now have to fire them? What did we miss on the onboarding or training or development? Maybe it was years that they worked for the company and the company's now outgrown them. So why didn't we continue with the skill development? But I think there's a bit of a debrief and a self-examination that companies should do to help them recognize that there's other things that they could do so they don't have the turnover going forward, or they don't have the turnover as frequently, or they don't
Yeah.
outgrow other people.
Well, and I think that's also one of the things that can help you become good at hiring is having some failures and learning from them, and instead of just repeating the same mistake over and over again.
Yeah, yeah. But again, that's some of it is that's where I think I get so frustrated watching so many companies trying so hard. Companies are very similar to humans. All humans go through a normal development stage. They're born and they're so dependent on their mom and dad. And then they become little toddlers and they start pushing back. Then they become teenagers and they start asserting some of their independent and, pushing back on mom and dad. Then they move out of the house for the first time in the early 20s and they realize, oh shit, maybe my mom and dad weren't as stupid as I thought they were, but I'm still glad I have my independence. And then they have kids for the first time and they go, wow, my mom and dad must have tried as hard as they did because this is way fucking harder than I thought it was. And then we move on to become, seniors or adults, and we start having the wisdom some of that time. Companies go through that same evolution as well, right? Companies need to start, struggle, fail. I interviewed, or I was talking to a CEO one time, and I said, "Have you ever had any training on doing job interviews?" He said, "No, but I've interviewed and hired 60 people." And I said, "Have you ever had turnover?" And he said, "Of course." And I said, "Do you think that maybe you've done all of the interviews wrong, even though you've been doing them the same way?" He goes, wow, it's
Mhm.
never occurred to me. But
Yeah.
some of that is that evolution that, okay, maybe I'll now listen to mom and dad because I've now been able to go out. I remember when I moved out at 21, 22 years old, I was finally out of the house for the full time. I'm like, shit, how do I really do laundry? What do I take to dry cleaning? I got to start making some food other than these three dishes that I know how to make, like paying bills. Like life just started to get really way more complicated than I'd given my parents credit for. And that was just my next evolution.
Right. That's an interesting analogy there.
It also goes back to why the best athletes in the world have coaches, and then they know that to become the best and to stay the best, they're always coaching, they're always developing. But why don't companies have their employees in all business areas training and working on their skills on a weekly basis? Right? If you look at any pro athlete, they spend 80% of their week training and only 10% performing and maybe 10% decompressing. And yet we have employees working really hard 40 hours a week, and maybe 1 or 2 weeks a year we think of training them. I think we're doing it all wrong. I think we should
Right.
be looking at training our people on a weekly basis on some area to grow their skills, their confidence, their connections, so that we can get results through people, so that they can deliver better, so that they feel secure in their roles, and so that the company doesn't outgrow them. And if we can put systems in place like that to grow our people when companies are smaller, we get a much bigger result. Somebody said to me, well, if I spend all this money on training people and they quit, what then? And I said, well, what if you don't spend money on training them and they stay? Right? What's the cost to your
Right.
company of your people just making mistakes and doing it all the wrong way and staying for an extra year? The cost of inaction is always higher than than the cost of investing to grow people.
So, where do you see the balance between training on existing processes versus cutting edge training where you're actually, innovating? Or maybe you're putting them in the seat of the innovator where they're learning new things that are not
Yeah,
standardized.
I go back to what Simon Sinek did with his golden circle. He had the why and then the how and then the what. The why being the inner circle, the how being the middle circle, and the what being the outer circle. Most companies train on the what. They train on the processes and what we do day to day and what all our systems are. They forget to train on the inner circle first, which is stuff around core values, core purpose, our vivid vision, the history of the company, the culture of our company, really getting to the essence of why we exist and how we show up every day as an organization. There needs to be ongoing training around that, like a cult, to keep people indoctrinated in the core. What I focus on is the middle ring, is the how. And those tend to be the soft skills of leadership that every manager needs to be good at, and no one has really had any training in. So I identified 12 core leadership skills. That's how I actually created my Invest in Your Leaders training, was those 12 core skills. But it's training people on how they lead others, right? Situational leadership, coaching, delegation, project management, time management, handling conflict, running interviews, running effective meetings, classroom teaching, communication, the skills that they need day to day. And it's less of what they're doing and it's more of how they're doing it. I think that training needs to be ongoing. And then in terms of like teaching people on the bleeding edge, like stuff around IT or AI as an example, I like doing right now creating a virus internally where I want my employees showing each other what they're using AI for on a weekly basis, just to expose each other as to what it can do, right? Imagine if we all saw every business area, let's say marketing showed up every Monday and every person in marketing did a 5 minute demo and a screencast of something they used AI for that week and shared it with everyone else in their group. That alone would supercharge the company, right? Everybody being exposed to 5 or 6 things for 52 weeks in a row, they'd be exposed to 300 things that AI do. It doesn't cost anything. It becomes infectious. Um, yeah, so that's kind of my approach
Right.
to it.
And it builds like this competition for who
Yeah.
has the coolest ideas.
Well, and just even who just has ideas, like, because sometimes we just don't even know what it can do.
Right. So I wanted to, and that's such a great way to break that down. Um, I wanted to go into, you've worked with a number of companies that are fast growth. One of the ones that you brought up was the 1-800 Get Junk. Did I say that right? Get Junk?
Gotcha. That's okay.
Got Junk. Okay. So thinking about that company and also maybe any other companies that are in that space where you help to be able to create that fast amount of growth, what have you seen has changed now versus that was a number of years ago? What is changing in the landscape for creating rapid growth?
Hmm. I was just talking to a group a couple days ago about this, and I said that we need to keep our focus on AI and what it can do and how it can leverage and how it can help us go faster. And we need to focus on the day-to-day, the bread and butter, and the what's working, what's always been working. So I think we can take our eye off that ball and get distracted by that big shiny object of all the cool things AI can do and really miss the opportunity to connect with our customers, to upsell our current customers, to get referrals from our current customers, like the basics of growth and revenue. I think we can get distracted by that big shiny object of tech. And I think it's important for companies, but you have to do both, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was seeing too. So, when my team brought on this topic, I'm like, I actually really like this topic on the kind of the old school things that have worked 100 years ago and will work 100 years from now, and they'll need to be verified. I mean, excuse me, modified for the market and the conditions, but it's ultimately the same thing around building relationships and around providing value and how do you be able to get referrals through doing exceptional work and through what we see is like giving yourself away as a gift. It's actually one of the simplest ways to be able to get more referrals and be able to grow from a systematized way in that regard.
Yeah, and I just also think it's dangerous for companies to ignore that tech can actually help supercharge the organization. Like I remember coming into
Yeah,
1-800 Got Junk 25 years ago now and saying that I wanted to use a laptop day to day, and they laughed at me because they're like, "What are you gonna do? Carry your laptop from meeting to meeting?" I was like, "Yeah." And then I wanted to use Wi-Fi, and they thought that was a security risk. And then like now, could you imagine even running a company without, an internet presence? Like we took the company from doing 100% of our revenue with people phoning the 800 number. I mean, that was our name, 1-800 Got Junk, to when I left in 2007, 30% of our revenue in 2007 was being generated from people booking a calendar appointment on our website. And that was
right.
19 years ago. So we were definitely pushing on tech and we were focusing on today. But I think it's dangerous for people out there to kind of keep their head in the sand and say, well, tech won't change things. No, it absolutely will. Like it
Yeah,
will
it
make
is changing.
yeah, and it will make your business more efficient and more profitable. And maybe you won't lay off people. But I think it's really dangerous to only focus on the basics.
Yeah.
However, yeah, if you get so distracted and you're only focusing on tech, you're going to miss the opportunity. You could have doubled your company just by focusing on the basics. You know who did a good job with this was in the movie Wall Street, where you've got
Mm.
this young stockbroker, Bud Fox, who every day calls Gordon Gekko to bag the elephant, right? To land the biggest client. But every day he only spends 5 minutes trying to bag the elephant. He spends the other 8 or 9 hours a day doing his bread and butter business. And I think companies need to operate with both, on both sides of that line.
Yeah, I think that is a very wise statement. So, Cameron, as we're closing, what is one question that I haven't asked that maybe I should have asked you? You'd like to leave any parting remarks?
Well, the one that I always go back to is that none of this actually matters.
Say
And
more.
I got a tattoo on my arm last year that it says walking each other home in Hindi. And it's the Ram Dass quote reminding each other that none of this matters. We're just taking care of each other until we die. We are just walking each other home. That, at the end of the day, when we get so focused around our business and business being our hobby, like business isn't a hobby, it's a business.
Yeah,
Hobbies are hobbies. I just saw that the founder of OnlyFans, who is worth billions of dollars, just died yesterday at 47 years old. Well, he's not taking those billions with him. And
yeah,
I really hope he enjoyed the journey of building the business because nobody wants to hear a lawyer talk about law or a dentist talk about dentistry or an accountant talk about accounting. They certainly don't want to hear an entrepreneur talking about their business. And I think we need to balance this out with let's be passionate about what we're working on and let's have some passions that we're passionate about. Let's have some
yeah.
hobbies that we're passionate about. Let's focus on those and have some fun at those too.
Yeah, that was one of the prescriptions I gave to one of my clients this week was to go get a life. And I was kind of joking around it, but she's like, well, I actually don't have any hobbies. Like, that's time, and the act of actually putting that in place and putting the things that you enjoy in your life first, those things are going to add pleasure and enjoyment. That's going to create some natural boundaries where you're going to work in, and you'll be able to get more done
Yeah. Well, and it
in less
allows you to
time.
then say no to and It's really wild that the number of people who have become more asking of me to help them because they're seeing me work less and be balanced more and having more hobbies and saying no more. It also forces me to delegate more. Like I always build better companies by delegating and growing people's skills instead of doing it myself.
Yeah, I
And
would completely agree with that.
our to-do list does not have our name on it, right? It doesn't say Bob's to-do list. So we can delegate everything on that to-do list to somebody else and spend our time growing them.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen some of the biggest breakthroughs happen during the quarters where I have worked the least, where, for whatever reason, I've needed to be out. And it's incredible to see the team continue to grow and innovate, especially when I'm not there. So,
Exactly.
Cameron, how can people find you?
Yeah, easiest place is my main website, which is CameronHerold.com. It's Herold. So CameronHerold.com. It has links to my online course, Invest in Your Leaders, has links to my podcast, it has links to all 7 of my books, my YouTube channels. It's all there. It's actually
All
set up
right.
like a link tree, so it makes it really easy to find everything.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate hearing all of your wisdom and your expertise, and of course your closing remarks, reminding us that none of this all matters and that we're just here to um, to love and enjoy each other and just grow along the way.
You got it. Thanks for having me, Mandy. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Hands Off CEO with Mandi Ellefson. If you want to work less and make more, make sure you subscribe and get a new episode every week, and help spread the word by leaving a review.